All right. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here and for taking the time out of your day to tune into our presentation. I'm really excited to have Art Gover and Stephanie Perles with us today to talk about how to strategically protect our native plants from invasive species. I'm going to give them a moment to introduce themselves, but before we do that, I just want to take a moment to introduce myself as well. So my name is Amy Jewett, and I am the Invasive Species Coordinator at the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy and the Pennsylvania Natural Heritage Program. I'm based in the Pittsburgh region. Today, I'm joining you all from my home office in Valencia, Pennsylvania, which is in southern Butler County. And my role at the Conservancy is to manage a program called IMAP Invasives. I've been doing that for just shy of 10 years now. Happy again to have this presentation today, as it fits in very well with the work of IMAP Invasives. Just want to note, there was a lot of interest in today's presentation. We have over 400 people that were registered, so that's really exciting. I do want to mention also, we will have time at the very end for questions. Everyone should see a Q&A option in the Zoom, and so you can choose to use that. You can type your questions during the webinar or at the very end, but we will definitely take time at the very end to answer questions. So I want to give Stephanie and Art a chance to introduce themselves, and then we'll get started with the presentation. So Stephanie, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Stephanie Perles. I am the plant ecologist for the Eastern Rivers and Mountains Inventory and Monitoring Network of the National Park Service. I've been mapping, monitoring, and helping parks manage vegetation for over 20 years in the Mid-Atlantic region, and I am based in State College, Pennsylvania.
And Art, go ahead.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Art Gover. First, I want to thank Amy for the opportunity to do this, as well as participate in the last summer's newsletter as well. It's a tremendous opportunity, and I really thank her for this opportunity. Stephanie, can we just go to the next slide? What I'd like to point out to everybody, so, sort of the emails you got. So, my current affiliations, Fruittown Land Stewardship Services, which is, the company of one. So this is my post-retirement gig, doing planning and operational restoration work, habitat work with landowners, agencies, conservancies. But everything we're talking about today is really immersed or originated and was what I was doing at Penn State between 2007 and when I retired in 2021. So it's critical to point out that that was a collaborative effort that was fully funded by the Bureau of State Parks, TCNR. So what I want to point out here is my initial primary and ongoing collaborator with that was Rachel Reese. This work was implemented through Penn State's Wildland weed management project. Can we go to the next slide? And other critical folks that made this thing go were all of the parks within the state park system that participated, and the 3 field service specialists that really helped ramp the program up. So that's Mike DiRinaldo, Emily Euchre, and Sean Robbins. And I really want to give a shout out to Tom Forstmeyer, who worked with me at Penn State. And as we get a little bit farther into this, today's emphasis isn't so much the nuts and bolts, the software side of how we did it, but Tom Forstmeyer's work in taking what was a largely manual process and automating it, what was critical to develop the efficiency. Next. And then finally, just at the Penn State side of it, I was the full-time guy that was there all the time, but for this to really work, there was just tremendous cadre of seasonal help that really made it go. So I just want to make it clear that I'm the one doing the talking here, but this was a very extensive effort with a lot of people involved. Okay, next. So the fundamental premises that we need to address here today, and hopefully this will help make some of these things that might come off as initially counterintuitive make a little more sense. I don't think we're going to argue that invasive species are a real threat to the integrity of native plant communities. The big thing we're going to be talking about today, or overarching, or kind of, the dark clouds over us as we try to do this, is that our resources to do the work are extremely finite. That our objective is to increase native species. We're going to be talking about targeting, suppressing, controlling invasive species, but what we're doing is increasing native species. The emphasis here is doing something with what you know as soon as possible, and really operationally keeping it simple. And we'll kind of get into this idea of what I'm calling bundling operations next. So to emphasize the finite resources, one of the things that working with, well, really anybody that engages this, is if they haven't been doing it for a while, is having them understand that you can't address all of it, and that the effort is ongoing. And actually, as Dan Berenger said once, and it stuck with me, was that the effort is perpetual, and just what you're trying to do is move it from daunting to manageable over time. Triage is going to be necessary. You just have to come to the understanding that there's areas worthy of protection and areas that you're just not going to get to. Next. The other the other paradigm here is just, even though we always talk about that, if you will, controlling native species, and just, our language is, I'll say, militaristic or confrontational, controlling, killing, the satisfaction is, look at that brown vista there, where we just did that work. But the underlying premise here is what we're really trying to do is flip sites so that they're more native than they were exotic, which is really going to, as we get into selecting places where we're going to work, a key point. And then using the phrase, you protect the best. Operationally, you're going to tend to work from good areas towards bad. Next. The other thing that this approach really emphasized was accumulate all the information you have, if you will, at hand or is readily accessible, and put that plan together and go out and implement it. There's that sense of, if I only had a little better survey information, if I just had some more data, I could make a more clear decision. And that's absolutely true. But when you look at what it is, for those of you that have done this, you realize that there's just so many variables in play, and you get the realization you're never going to know the absolute best place you should be working with your finite resources. So get out there, get started, work in a worthy place. And one of the things we found is, through repeated effort, as people were out in the field and now making those fairly tight transects through the landscape and learning what to look for, that process in and of itself developed and identified better places to work. The other aphorism there is, we avoid paralysis by analysis. Next. And once we get operational, one of the things I would stress is we're really, the term of bundling operations is, I guess I'll put it this way, we almost never go out targeting a single species. And part of that is that mobilization is so daunting. Just getting all the people that you need together on a given day, showing up and remembering their gear and their PPE, and, oh, I thought you were bringing the herbicide. So once you've jumped over that hurdle and you're ready to go, you want to make sure you can address all of those invasive species, all of those target species that are present, not get yourself into a position of, here's the most charismatic target, and finding out that you're walking by targets that you can't treat because you selected a method that was so species specific. The other thing I'll stress here is in an ongoing basis, the critical thing that we found was teaching the participants how to identify the species. The technicalities of application or why we're choosing a different mix, that really can be clarified on the day. But folks, once they learn to identify the species, then you build into their day-to-day activities. They become your survey group. Next, please. All right, so looking at it from a state park setup, actually now there's 124 state park properties, 3 new ones in the system, but within the Pennsylvania state park system, you don't have someone at the park level whose job it is to be the natural resource manager. That's a regional function or area function. And you don't have top-down directives to do the work. So this was very much a hearts and mind campaign to get folks at the park level to engage the process. And to make the system work, you have 3, well, soon to be 4, area or regional field service specialists or conservation biologists, if you will, operational biologists, who help the parks identify the work needs to be done and contribute operationally as well. And State Parks funded this project at Penn State, which created 1 full-time person, some seasonal folks to help facilitate that work. And the other thing, of course, is everything is finite except the targets. Next. The tool we're going to describe, what it's accounting for is both location and the species in the location. So what we're looking at, ecosystem integrity within a given location or a subunit of the landscape for which you're responsible, and then looking at the species that are in those subunits. Now, the data that we were going to use is a lot of the parks have had heritage program surveys. You have the existing resource management plan, which is kind of a compendium of decades of observation of what's going in there. You have the in-house knowledge of the park staff and volunteers, and then you also have critical information from Pennsylvania's Natural Diversity Inventory, or PNDI program. You gather that together, and really the idea is you get on the ground now. Towards the end, we could put one of these plans together. We could meet with the park staff, and depending on the dynamics of the personnel in the meeting, you could have a plan and a work date set in 2 to 4 hours. Next. Other assumptions, particularly if you rather than being, if you will, a contracted applicator, if you are dedicated to a particular landscape, the incremental nature of your work is very clear. If you just look at it mathematically, it sounds very great to say, okay, if you get 90% control 2 years in a row, you've got 99%. 90% is, it's great. I've been doing this for a while. If I get 90%, I'm pretty happy. And it could be I'm just not as good as I think I am, but it's particularly when you're doing spot treatment work in settings, looking for targets, trying to treat them in under challenging situations. It's not unreasonable. Let's look at the second metric there. If you're getting 70% reduction, but still, if you get 70% reduction 2 consecutive years on a site, you're at over 91% removal of those exotic species. And a lot of times you kind of, you keep hearing the phrase as you get into these dense patches sort of stuck into your otherwise fairly intact areas is, you're not going to get it all at once. You're just taking it off in layers, peeling that onion. Next. So the process then is we go through this prioritization, looking at the site and the species. We develop the prescriptions to do the work. come up with the work calendar based on those prescriptions and the species, and then you do the implementation. And our intent always was that over time, the park would increase the process ownership. And built into it too was that when there were external resources available, when grant funding was there, the parks that had taken that effort to engage the process in this bottom-up situation would be closer to the front of the line to get these external resources as well. Next. I do want to stress this came about. Actually, if you look at the two approaches, you might almost be hard pressed to say, did you guys revise anything from this original plan? But the Nature Conservancy used to have a site called PNC Weeds, and this site weed management plan template was up there. And when we were looking, beginning in 2007, it's like, okay, we're going to do this work. How do we do it? This was one of the first tools we found. And right away, I was like, this is pretty good. Like, I get it. We understand it. It's conceptually easy to implement. So why wouldn't we just go with this? So, what we do now, there are some differences. I guess what I would stress is over 14 years doing it operationally, you do have that opportunity to revise and make things work differently or better suited to what you're doing operationally. But, really, if you just want to see where this came from, this is the source. Next. So that prioritization process, first thing you do is you take your entire landscape and you think of it, if you want to, you can think of, all right, what are the areas I have here that I'm not going to manage? Kind of back to that triage idea, like, or for our purposes, since we really integrated this or made it clear that what we're doing is habitat management. Because when you're trying to get buy-in from folks with different backgrounds, it's sort of like nobody doesn't think that more or improving habitat is a bad idea. Sorry, I lost track of my negative. But the idea being everybody's in favor of better habitat. Whereas, I think you would still sometimes get, I don't know, the whole plant blindness thing with invasive species. Like, it's all green to me, but if you point out, no, we can have much better habitat if we get rid of some of these species and leave others. So first thing you do, you take that large property, you break it into subunits and go through the process of identifying which subunits are more ecologically intact. And also we get into this idea of this, what we're calling outreach value here, which is, what it boils down to, yeah, it's awesome, but who cares? With the idea being, if it's an area that not only has ecological integrity, but it's in a public location where people see the work and say, hey, what are you doing? You say, I'm glad you asked, let me tell you. Or in a state park level, if your environmental educators can use that work for programming to inform camp or park visitors, awesome. Or it's a site that's awesome enough that it attracts external resources. We're giving higher priority to those type of sites. And then you look at the invasive species themselves, and we're looking at the characteristics of what's the extent, what's the impact of that species in that location, and let's talk about that restoration effort. And over time, we were able to automate most of this through this Excel workbook. So next. If you boil it down to the points that were assigned, when we started out, it was a 16-point system, but what we did is it's a 10-point system. People understand 10. 4 of those points describe the land unit itself. So 40% of our prioritization is what's going on in that particular land unit. The other 6 points are the invasive species. Next. This would just be an example of, okay, you choose a park. And so all of the green here is a state park. This happens to be Ohio Pile. It's a 20,000 acre park. The areas in blue are the areas that were identified as targeted work areas or habitat management zones. So you see that acres wide, most of it's not being addressed. So, you know, here what you have is designated natural areas, riparian corridors. I don't have the Yakagani, the blue ribbon running through the whole thing highlighted here, but that was one of the work areas as well. But what I just want to stress is in going through this process, that you're clarifying to yourself that I can't work on 20,000 acres. I'm not even sure I can work on the 1,000 that are located here, but at least I can identify them as priorities and rank those and begin working on those. Next. I want to stress this idea of restoration effort as we're assigning these index values. So what we mean by that is, well, let's just look at the chart. The y-axis is effort, generalized. X is time. And kind of the best case scenario, if you're doing work, trying to move a site from what we'll call the control phase, right here I'm calling it the release phase, and transitioning into that maintenance phase where, once again, your effort is perpetual, but the idea is over time, you work really hard, you get it down to a maintenance phase, and then maybe this now becomes a site that you need to address. Even if you're addressing it every year, the effort is just a very small percentage of the original effort, or it's a site that you need to revisit and do some spot suppression maybe every 2, 3, or 4 years. So 3 would be the ideal. That's, I work hard for 2 or 3 years, I get this to a maintenance phase, and now I have that increased ratio of native species I want in my site, and I can maintain it with minimal effort. As you move to 2 and to 1 and then to 0, these are, okay, part of what's going on here is you've got less native species present. I mean, ideally what we're trying to do is choose sites where if you remove the invasive species, there's enough native species there to fill in. Either they're released from the seed bank or native shrubs, you remove the exotic shrubs, they just have room to fill in and take over that site. That's what 3 is representing. As you move into 2 and to 1, there's less native species to fill in, and it might even be to the point where your amount of native species is low enough that, okay, now I need to replant or I need to reseed. And you also have the repeated effort perhaps with difficult species, which is kind of tied into the lack of native species, because one of the things that's going to help a site convert is competition. And if native species are there and filling in, it's going to make it harder for the invasive species to reestablish or reclaim that area that you have removed them from. Next. What we end up with in our tool then is this, this eye chart, but where the columns are the locations, the habitat management zones, the rows of the species, and where you have colors lighting up, that's telling you, okay, this is where I need to work. So this is what the tool is doing for you, is just most of that matrix is white. Those are areas that are non-priority or low priority areas. And you're going to concentrate where you have colors drawing your eye. Next. The process really evolved. If you think about it, when the process first started, it took me 2 years to develop 4 plans, which was kind of the conventional, I'm going to make the, I guess what I would say, what a park manager, when I presented them with the fruits of my labors, the so-called fruits of my labors, great, another dust collector. It kind of boils down to nobody needs a 40-page document that not only explains why we're doing it and the methodology and all the background information. We really went from, if you will, that traditional report format to a 4-page document. And it went from a manual process, or in this case, this is like version 2.0, where you would do it in a workshop format. And there's 5 different parks represented in this room, and working with them to develop their plans to the point where it really was workbook based. You would sit down with the park, and as I mentioned before, you can have your plan developed, work day scheduled in about a half a day. Next. After you've developed the priority of where you're going to work, well, now you need those prescriptions. What am I going to do to address these invasive species I've identified here? And at this point, now we're calling up the traditional IPM approach and looking at the multiple tools, cultural, mechanical, biological, chemical, and occasionally just adjusting your attitude. Next, so now we're just going to blow through some examples. But replanting is a cultural technique, and here you're integrating it with chemical suppression as well to release that planted tree. Next, installing seed mixes in sites that perhaps were more exotic, but once again, this is an integration of a chemical operation to suppress what was there, and then the native seed mix. Next, looking at prescribed fire, very much think of it, it's primarily a cultural tool. You're enhancing the growth of the fire adapted species on that site. Now in the process, probably burning up some annual seed, you are definitely quite often getting what we might call thermal mowing of species to change that, but this is primarily to enhance the growth of fire adapted communities. Next. And you have your mechanical techniques, which can be, at the hand level, you're pulling, you're cutting, but certainly the ones that are more fun to look at, so forestry heads on a skid steer. Next. So that tool can turn, shrub thickets into mulch like this. Next. And I guess I should stress with the mechanical, that's quite often we'll use that as sort of a, if you will, a reset tool. Knock the area down, and then we can selectively release what grows back. With classical biological control, this is the mile a minute weevil that's released in a number of locations to address mile a minute vine. Next. And then as we get into the chemical techniques, this is the one that we would have most commonly used, so spot treatment. Because remember, we're working in areas where you have a native plant population, and ideally what you're trying to do is release them. So spot treatment was our primary tool, using a backpack system very much like this. Next. You would occasionally get, so this is a narrowleaf cattail stand, but this is something that grows in these immense thickets. Japanese knotweed would be another one where maybe even though you are sort of removing select bits from what is an otherwise intact landscape, they kind of grow in these monotypic thickets, and sometimes it's easier to treat them high volume. Next. You get into your stem treatment of woody species. So this would be an example of hack and squirt on a tree of heaven. So you're making spaced cuts, applying a concentrated herbicide to those cuts. Very selective, but brutally effective as long as you have low stem densities. Next. Basal bark, another stem treatment here. There's no cutting, no opening that up to expose the vascular tissue. You're applying an oil-based concentrated herbicide that diffuses through that bark. And in the growing season, translocates. In the dormant season, kind of gives you what we'd call chemical girdling. Next. Let's talk about the implementation. I guess really I'll just show a few pictures here of sort of like the fun places where we got to work. So next, so when we're working at Ohio Pile, dealing with Japanese knotweed in the Yakagani River Gorge, it really worked out the only way to do it. I shouldn't say the only way. The most efficient way to do it was by boat, and you're loading all of the gear onto boats at the upstream end of the work area and floating your way down to the targets, hopping off, doing the work, and having to get to the takeout by the end of the day. Next. This happens to be in Jennings, which is both a remnant prairie area as well as kind of a remnant beaver pond area, but just another example of This is actually a very nice stand of burr reed here. So, these gentlemen are picking their way through looking for loose strife and patches of cattail in this patch of American burr reed that has regenerated. Next. And by the way, that was fun. Doesn't look like it. And Pima tuning. One of their targets is patches of Phragmites starting to develop on some of the islands and at the margins of the lake. So you get to hop on an airboat and zip around and go to those sites. Next. I wanted to stress, so remember, ongoing, this is a perpetual process, but having the participants learn the species ID was the most critical phase of that, just so that then participants become your eyes on the ground, your survey team. Next. So I'm already over time, so I'm going to try to blow through this super quick. But what I wanted to do was, I kind of covered it, but I just kind of give you a sense of what the workbook is doing as we sit down and develop this plan when we gathered all the information together. So next. So as I mentioned before it starts out, what the first thing you do is you've identified these habitat management zones, your work areas. And this is the phase of the plan where you're identifying it, you're giving it that ecological integrity score on that 0 to 2 basis, as well as that outreach value. So you could be scoring your habitat management zones anywhere from a 0. I mean, what would be the point? Those shouldn't even be in consideration, up to a value of 4. Next. The next thing you do is you've established the work areas. Now you identify at the park level, or should say the property level or your landscape level, what species are present. So this tool, this phase of the workbook, based on DCNR's identified invasive species list, you select them. One thing I'll stress here is we do have the option of working at the individual species level, or if you prefer a more parsimonious approach, you can just say, do I really need to list 11 different species of exotic shrub? Because I'm going to manage them in a similar fashion. So I'm just going to identify exotic shrubs as a component. So we do have those categorization options in there as well. Next. You do manually enter for all those species in those locations the extent value, with the idea being if they're not there, barely there, it's a higher priority, and that gets a 2. 1 is, yeah, there's a fair amount. 0, I don't know if I could fit any more autumn olive in this spot. That would be kind of a coarse way to characterize that indexing. Next. The workbook itself, based on the community type that you've identified, the species and its extent, it will calculate that restoration effort for us that we talked about before. Next. The last thing you are going to do is you're going to enter a present absence value, because it may very well be that, remember, you identified species at the property level. It might be that in a particular management zone, you don't have that species. So you can basically drop it out of consideration by giving it, if you will, an absence value, assigning 0. You can also, even if it's not there, you can still say, well, I'm going to give it a positive value of 1 because it's a species that I'm concerned about and I want to make sure I survey for it. Next. This is what I showed you before. Now, this is just a hypothetical, property, but you're still getting at the end here, those areas that are red, orange, yellow. These are what the process has identified as your priority areas to do work, where each cell, remember, is the intersection of a location and a species. Next. What the workbook will do is generate, okay, based on all of these things that showed up in color, here's your potential work list, where each row in this particular table is a species and a location. Now, what we do here is gets back to that bundling idea, because typically there might be, if you saw on the slide before, some of those columns had a number of colored cells. Well, we might still condense all of that into one work outing where we're going to address all those species. So when we're done, a table like this, there might only be 2 or 3 entries in it as we've combined operations together. Next. So kind of what I was just describing. I should have just cut this slide out, but what this does is it allows you to identify, particularly where there's multiple phase projects. So let's just say you have Japanese knotweed or Oriental bittersweet, where that's a 2-phase thing at best, where let's cut these things first, and then let's treat the resprout at ground level. Well, I can use this tool to identify the multiple steps, and maybe I can get a friends group for volunteers to do the cutting. So identify who's going to do the different work. The foliar application to the regrowth, that needs to be a certified applicator, whether it's in-house or contractor, but you can identify that too. Next. And then finally, you end up with your work calendar. So for a given location and species, to the right side there, the shaded areas are during the season. This is when you should be doing the work. Next. And then you go out and you do the work. And I think what's critical where we had persistent effort is somebody at that park level was the process champion, took it upon themselves to be the ones that made sure at their end things stayed organized, and people stayed engaged. And typically within the park system, that was going to be somebody at the management level, either a manager or assistant manager. And there were a number of facilities where one of the environmental educators was that key person. The other thing that's really critical is, even though the cast of characters, because quite often what would happen is maintenance personnel would be recruited to do a lot of the work. And it's very helpful if you've got the same people year after year. A, they became familiar with the process, and B, I think the more critical thing is they got to see the results of their work and see the benefits of their effort. I mean, that's when people, okay, I really have made a difference here. And by having that staff continuity, you see that. Next. And then just kind of some statistics, if you will, over the tenure of when I was working with the state parks doing this, we did develop 28 plans. 26 of them actually got on the ground. If you look at where the work could get done, once the DCNR state parks entered into their field service specialist phase in 2015, we could start doing a lot more work. So between 2015 and 2019, the last pre-COVID year, and we were doing up to 20 parks a year, having these work days working with parks. Next. Just kind of this is what it could look like on a fairly large implementation, where you had the Penn State crew, you had the field service specialists, you had folks from the parks. This happens to be Presque Isle, which has a very large intern contingent doing the work. Next. And one last thing I'll just touch on is this idea of as the Governor's Invasive Species Council starts looking towards implementing that PRISM system, so Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management in Pennsylvania, I think this process that we're describing here is going to be a way where you can have both that bottom up and top down meet, if you will, at a functional location. Within that PRISM, within that region, the partners, those managing landscapes, could use this tool to develop their own priorities. Because at the PRISM level, you're going to have something like a steering committee that's making decisions about how to spend, if you will, other people's money on your landscape. So it's going to be a critical buy-in, your skin in the game to do that prioritization at your property level, and then come up to that steering committee level within the region to, if you will, make your pitch. So, that's what we're seeing, hoping that a tool like this could really be very functional in that now large region approach through the PRISM system. Next, which I think I'm done there. So thanks everybody. I went long, sorry. And I will turn it over to Stephanie.
Thanks, Art. I also want to thank Art for teaching me about this tool and a bunch of other folks in the National Park Service, because without his work, we would have never found this tool and never embarked on this process. So many thanks to Art. And also thanks to Amy for giving me the opportunity to share what we've done in the National Park Service with invasive plant management. So the last person I want to give a shout out to is Kate Miller. She's our quantitative ecologist in the Northeast region of the National Park Service, and she was instrumental in a lot of the work that I'm going to share with you today. Kate and I work for the Inventory and Monitoring Division, whose mission is to provide excellent ecosystem science and support to inform stewardship in our national parks. To do that, we've taken 270 national park units across the country and grouped them into 32 networks, which focus on inventory and monitoring the most important natural resources in those particular parks. The National Park Service's mission is to conserve resources unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. And you can't do that if you don't know the condition of the resources or how those conditions are changing. So that's the key role of the Inventory and Monitoring Division. Since forests are important resources in eastern parks, we've been monitoring forest health in over 40 national park units in the eastern US since 2007. And over those 15 years, we've learned a lot about the condition of the forest. By comparing our forest data to data from the US Forest Service, we found that our parks protect significantly older forest structure than the surrounding forest. So this includes large standing trees, dead standing trees, coarse wooded debris, and our forests provide important habitat for organisms like salamanders, woodpeckers, that are reliant on large trees and dead wood. And these features are underrepresented in the surrounding forest. We also found that forests provide greater stand level tree diversity than the surrounding forest. So even though eastern national parks are not as large as Yosemite or Yellowstone, they still protect regionally significant resources that are underrepresented. But invasive plants are one of the major threats and an influential stressor in many of our park forests. Over the 12 years of monitoring, we found significant increases in invasive plant cover in over 80% of the parks that we monitor. In the graph on the left, each of those red lines represents one park that has a significant increase in invasive plant cover. The only one blue line is Marsh-Billings-Rockefeller National Historic Site in Vermont, who showed a decrease in invasive plant cover, and they have a very active forest management program. The graph on the right shows individual invasive species in parks. You can see that in yellow, Japanese stiltgrass is the worst offender and is increasing in most parks. There's also many invasive exotic shrubs that we're all too familiar with in the region that are increasing in many parks. So invasive plants are abundant in eastern national parks. They are spreading, they're threatening regionally significant forests. What are we going to do with this overwhelming problem? So my title slide said all hope is not lost, and that is true. Instead of just throwing in the towel and giving up, we can tackle invasive plants through three main strategies. And managing your special places is the tool that Art talked about and that I'll talk about as well. But I wanted to briefly mention two complementary approaches: early detection, rapid response, and biological controls. So early detection, rapid response is an important tool for new invasives that are just establishing in your park. But many parks in our region use iNaturalist to help citizen scientists be able to contribute their observations about new invasive plants that are new to the parks. So this isn't going to work for all invasives, but invasives that are new to your park, this is the most cost-effective way to deal with them, is early detection and then a rapid response. For plants that are already abundant and widespread throughout large areas of your park, biological controls are the only feasible solution, like the mile-a-minute weevil that Art showed a picture of. It's not going to eliminate the plant, but at least it will knock back the invasive and allow natives to coexist with the invasive plant. So let's return to managing your special places. The beauty of the prioritization tool that Art just walked you through is that it focuses how to use finite resources most effectively. The key to being successful at invasive plant management is to focus on the most important sites. If you have limited resources, which we all do, use them where they'll have the most impact. Manage the places that make your park special. I'm using the word park, but this process can apply to almost any protected area, regardless of who owns it. So the first step, like Art described, is to define the habitat management zones. find those special places in the park, either ecologically or culturally, or maybe both. And defending those places from being overrun by invasives is a win. If you don't know the places of high ecological value in your park or your protected area, contact your state natural heritage program. And like Art said, if the zones that you create shouldn't cover the entire park, it will be more effective if you don't pick every place in the park to manage, because that's probably not feasible. The next step is to use available data on the presence and absence of invasive plants in your park. You don't need comprehensive data, like Art said. In most cases, a field survey that records which invasive plants are present and whether they're common, rare, or abundant would be sufficient. You can also harvest data from places like iNaturalist, from IMAP Invasives, from EDSMaps. And it's okay if the data are old, because the invasives are probably still there and they're probably more abundant than whenever the data was collected. So like Art showed, the tool combines the priorities of the habitat management zone with the effort that it would take to remove those invasive plants, and it gives you management priorities. Places that have high ecological or cultural value and low invasives, those are going to be your management priorities. Places that are totally overrun by invasives and have little value ecologically or culturally are going to be low management priorities. And once you have your priorities, the next step is to create detailed treatment prescriptions. In the National Park Service, we have regional invasive plant management teams who are experts in treating invasive plants. And we collaborate with those team leads who input their recommendations directly into the tool, like Art just showed you, about who will do the work and where the work will be done and how the work will be done. And then the tool generates a calendar, just like you just saw, to guide when the activities should occur. And that creates the plan to protect the park. So the spreadsheet in the upper left is a screenshot from one of our parks, Fort Necessity National Battlefield in southwestern Pennsylvania. But the Excel tool is not magic, right? It doesn't magically give us the answers that we didn't know before. It's not going to spit out exactly what we should do and enlighten us on how we should get rid of invasive plants in our parks. The secret sauce to this process is the collaboration. For the National Park Service, this tool has brought the right people together at the table and has guided our conversations in the right way. So park managers know the special places in their parks. Inventory and monitoring scientists have the needed data, and the invasive plant management teams know how best to treat invasive plants. And so when we bring all those people together on the same team, we can efficiently direct our limited resources and be successful at managing invasive plants. So far, we've created invasive species management plans for over a dozen national parks in the eastern US, ranging from West Virginia to Massachusetts. We have a dozen more slated for the next 2 years. For us, the process has been about 4 teams meetings over a span of weeks or a month in order to put together a plan. And we've heard feedback from parks such as, the tool not only helped us decide where to work, it also helped us decide where not to work. We realized we were spending a lot of time in areas that were not our highest priority, and the plan helped us refine our approach and improve our efficiency. I'll give you a couple of examples here. In the national parks of Western Pennsylvania, which includes Fort Necessity, we developed an ArcGIS online platform to help the park managers see the invasive data, so where the plants are occurring, and also where the treatment priorities are in the habitat management zones. So they can use this online platform either in the office, or they can also take it in the field with them on tablets or on phones. And it helps them plan the work effort for their seasonal staff in the summer when they have interns. It helps plan volunteer work days. It also helps them with annual reporting. And they also track their invasive plant treatment using this platform as well. For Minuteman National Historical Park in Massachusetts, their invasive species management plan really helped them collaborate more efficiently with their partners. You can see a map there on the top of the screen. The red is the outline of the park, and you can see they span multiple municipalities. They're also near a major highway and a regional airport. So they have lots of engaged partners that are coming to the park with maybe their priorities on management. And this invasive species management plan has helped the park communicate to all those engaged partners more clearly what their priorities are. And so it helps them prioritize which projects they're actually going to tackle. The Gauley River National Recreation Area in southern West Virginia The prioritization tool in that park clearly identified the riparian zone as the highest priority zone to work in, both ecologically and culturally. So they're treating invasive plants there in conjunction with habitat restoration for a federally listed plant, Virginia spirea. So the invasive species management plan is helping, restore habitat for a protected plant. So through those examples, you can see that it is possible to be successful at invasive species management when we collaborate to prioritize the most ecologically valuable places where invasive treatment is possible. And these gorgeous wildflowers and the natural resources of our protected areas and parks are worth that effort. So with that, I will turn it over to Amy.
Okay, great. Thanks, Stephanie. That was wonderful. And Art, thank you also for your part in the presentation. I do want to kind of quickly go through this part about IMAP invasives, as I want to leave some time at the end for some questions that I see that are coming in. But I just want to wrap things up and talk a little bit more about how this invasive plant prioritization tool can be used in conjunction or as a complement with the IMAP invasives program, which I am one of the lead administrators for here in the state of Pennsylvania. So for anyone who isn't already familiar with IMAP invasives, it is an online database. It is map-based, and it's used for tracking where we're finding invasive species, and as well as those management efforts. And sometimes people will use that platform kind of as their own little hub to incorporate that data and then use that within their organization. We also receive data that's already been collected by an organization. Maybe they have like another type of tracking database like what Stephanie talked about, and we incorporate like large dumps of data into IMAP invasives as a way to kind of help build up the information that we can provide to people, so we can really help to show where these invasives are in the state and the work that's being done to manage them. So at the national level, the IMAP invasives program is managed by NatureServe, which is a nonprofit organization. And individually, the states and provinces that have an IMAP invasives program, we have these, administrators like myself that will kind of take charge of the data that's coming in, making sure that we're getting that information incorporated into the program, and also quality checking it to make sure that the species IDs are correct, the mapping is done appropriately, and also, conducting trainings and hosting special presentations like what we're doing today. So we do have some mobile apps that can be used in conjunction with IMAP invasives. So even though the online platform can be used from a desktop computer and you can enter data or view data that way, we do have two mobile apps. One is referred to as our classic mobile app, and we also have Survey 123, that can be used to go and folks can use those apps to actually be out in the middle of nowhere and collect data and have that go into IMAP invasives directly. The apps are not used to view data in the platform. They are just data collection tools, which can really make it a lot simpler for folks. You don't need a pen and paper to jot down everything. You can take the app out with you, and it will really help to expedite that process of data collection. So if you're curious and you'd like to learn a little bit more about the IMAP invasives program, you can go to either imapinvasives.org or paimapinvasives.org. Next, please. So as I mentioned, we do have these two mobile apps. You can scan either one of these QR codes, and it will take you directly to some online videos that we have on YouTube that kind of walk you through the process of how to use these apps if you've not used them before. If you don't scan the QR codes now, you can always just go right to YouTube and you can look them up by typing in the titles that you see here on the screen. So that's going to be kind of a quick and easy way to learn more about these apps if you're not already familiar with them. And I think there's one more slide, Stephanie. Thank you. So to kind of wrap things up with what Art and Stephanie already talked about with this invasive plant prioritization tool, I want to talk a little bit more about how IMAP invasives can be incorporated into that tool as far as looking at data that we already have in the platform, then also contributing additional information. So when you go out to a site and you want to prioritize the work that's being done there, in addition to relying on your own surveys or the surveys that have been done by your organization, it's important to recognize that there may have been someone else or a group of people that have come out to that same area previously and already documented information, maybe for a species that you weren't aware that existed. And so it's really important to come to a tool like IMAP Invasives, which is online, free to use, open to the public if you have a registered account. And just use the tool to query for the data that have been found in a specific geographic area and hone in on that and just kind of analyze that information. Make sure you have the full picture in front of you. But then in addition to actually looking at the data that's already in there, you can then go in and record and share the data that you are finding in these areas by looking at, what is present, what are the invasive species that are there. Maybe you also want to document the invasive species that you were searching for, but you didn't find. So we also have the ability to record absence information as well. So maybe there's a early detection species that you were looking for that you didn't find, and it might be really valuable to make sure you can include that. So IMAP will allow you to do that as well. And then certainly the work that's being done to actually manage these species, the treatment efforts, that is also a capability in IMAP invasives that can be used. So in addition to being able to record each of these data types separately, we do have the option in IMAP where you can actually record what we call a searched area, or kind of a larger area where you conducted your surveys. And you can go in and record multiple presences or multiple absences, in addition to then maybe some treatment efforts as well. And that's a tool called a multi-record searched area that you can access in the online platform. And so if you click on that, it will prompt you to go through the process of adding the appropriate records that you'd like to add. So you don't have to do presence record, presence record, presence record. This data type will allow you to do all of that at the same time. So it really kind of expedites that process. And so I do want to mention that, so for that multi-record searched area tool, you will need to use either Survey 123 or the IMAP Invasives online platform. The classic mobile app will not allow you to have access to that tool. So with that, I will wrap things up. I think that was our last slide. So Art and Stephanie, if you want to come back on with your video and your audio, we can go through and answer some of the questions that are coming in. And I just want to say again, thank you both for your wonderful presentations. That was very interesting. And I forgot to mention at the beginning, but I wanted to mention here. So the reason why today's presentation came to be is that Art and Stephanie graciously put together an article for our newsletter earlier this year about this tool. And that, when I read that article, it really changed my outlook on what do we mean by invasives management and the releasing of native species. Like, that is our goal. It's not just to get rid of invasives or to manage them, but it's really to try to bring back that native population of species that we want to be in those areas. And so I thought that was such a cool concept that, even though I think many of us know that, it really kind of brings it to the forefront. And so I was really glad that we were able to make today's talk possible. So thank you both very much. And with that, we did have some questions come through, so I will go through those in the order that they came in. Art, the first one, there was a question, I think at the beginning of your slide, you had a photo in the background of a particular location, and someone was just asking where that location was. If you recall your first slide in the presentation, we're going to make you remember.
Well, yeah, so the first slide, as I recall, let me think. So that would be at Ohio Pile. Actually, that's an area known as the beach. So if you're, the Youghiogheny River runs through Ohio Pile. The area upstream of the falls is called the Middle. So that's an area of the Middle Yough, and operationally that was key for us, because if you're starting that knotweed work, you would go to the very, if you will, upstream end of the park, and that's where we would work to get out on the first day. Sorry, I'm sure it's more detailed than you wanted, but so that is a location on the Yough, in the Yough River Gorge, where, as I mentioned, it just worked out that even though the Allegheny Passage runs along there, it was much easier to do that work from boats.
Okay, very good, thank you. We had a question come in from Mark. He asked, should more native be the goal in areas that are clearly past the first wave of heavy invasions, Or should we be broadening our goals and our ways of monitoring, such as for birds, pollinators, herp habitat values that may not fully align with native versus exotic metrics? I've been at this for 27 years and have seen lots of post-treatment low diversity sites that don't readily regain structure and diversity.
Well, I was very intrigued by the premise of, so I'll say, Amy, I'm very guilty of, well, I'm a plant person for one thing. So I don't have the background to look at a site and sort of know that, oh, that's some great herp habitat there, other than, seeing rattlesnakes sunning themselves, that sort of thing. So I'm very much guilty of just using plant diversity, native plant diversity, as my indicator for habitat quality. So now there's a couple facets to that, but you say our priorities are definitely going to be more towards where there's enough of a native species presence that we feel like if we do some selective suppression here, we can get an expansion or increase, or at a minimum, an improvement of that ratio of native to exotic.
Okay, great. Thank you. Stephanie, did you have anything to add to that?
From the invertebrate and insect perspective, I think native plants most always is favorable for the invertebrate and insect communities. After that, I'm not a bird or a herp person, so I don't want to speak past that.
Okay, well, thank you both for that. We had a question come in from Linda. She says, a list of invasives by priority for removal would be helpful. Can you identify any available resources, especially for invasives common in Western Pennsylvania? And thank you for your presentation.
Well, I don't want to re-ask their question, but I think I am a little bit, let's just say our premise here is really stressing that it really is an interaction of the location and the species. Rather than being species oriented, for me, there's so few species that in and of themselves are just so horrific that wherever they are, they become the priority. So I think I really think you need to look, sort of take that approach of what do I need to do first based on what are the areas I need to protect. And I don't know if there's a Western PA. I haven't seen something, let's say, breaks the state down smaller. But I think the list that DCNR has put together on the forestry side of their website it's a very nice resource, because there's a fact sheet for each species. Last time I looked at it carefully, there was 73, 74 species. I imagine they've expanded it too. But so sorry, I really kind of dodged the question, but just I really think I don't think you can escape the landscape itself or the integrity of that location when you're making that species level decision.
And Stephanie, anything to add to that?
I will echo that the type of habitat completely drives which species are important. One of the tabs of the prioritization tool worksheet that Art didn't show gives you an opportunity to rate super bad versus regular bad invasive species. So is there a particular one that is actually a true threat to your site more than other ones? And that is really different for all the different parks that we've worked in. They have different super bad invasive species. So again, it's very site specific.
And I was just going to say, oh, go ahead, Art.
Well, sorry, Amy. To what Stephanie said, I didn't really touch on it, but we do, that system does assign a bonus point, if you will, for species that, this is really bad, but it really is tied to the location. So I didn't really get into it. But one of the things you're doing when you identify those habitat management zones is at a, like I say, very coarse level, not like the pike 49 communities, or the revision, there's like 7 community types, but there are certainly species, it's like if you're identifying a wetland or a lakeshore, something like Phragmites is definitely going to get a bonus point, or narrow-leaf cattail, just because they're just going to run amok there. So we do have that way to sort of make something 10% worse based on where it is.
And I was just going to add that, you guys mentioned the DCNR invasive plant fact sheets, and there is other resources out there, like the Governor's Invasive Species Council has a list of invasives for the state as well, and that spans beyond plants, so that has other taxa as well. But in the email that I will be sending out after today's presentation, that will include a link to the recording, I can include some links to those resources as well, so folks have access to that.
Well, and I would be remiss to not point out that the Wildland weed management site has species specific, as well as, if you will, habitat type resources, and Penn State Extension. Within the last 3 or 4 years, Dave Jackson, Sarah Wurzbacher, just cranked out just tremendous resources, species specific fact sheets, identification videos. So I would definitely check out Penn State Cooperative Extension as well.
Yes, there's a plethora of really great resources out there, and I know about those, Art. I'm sorry I forgot to mention them. There's a lot of good things. I'll try to kind of provide a comprehensive list for folks to check out.
Well,
okay,
I should have mentioned them. I mean, they were my colleagues, but
well, it's okay. It got mentioned here at the end. So, okay, so our next question says, our local environmental advisory council cut off much of the privet invading our park, which also serves as the headwaters of a creek. They did plant some tree whips, but otherwise did nothing else about the privet other than giving it a haircut. It is now back with a vengeance. What might you suggest to control the privet?
that's kind of gets back to the slide about ongoing effort. So yeah, that's true. So there's 2 things there. Yeah, cutting something, it is going to grow back. So there's a couple options. If you're an entity that no one's going to have the certification or the inclination to use herbicides, that's a case where you just need to keep cutting it. And if you can prevent that plant from developing enough canopy to recharge the root system, you can wear it out. It just takes a long time. Now, in our situation, I mean, there were a number of settings where I can remember there was, like a remnant privet hedge, like in an old home setting in a park, and it was very much a multiple effort. One thing I'll stress, I'm a big advocate of using backpack-based applications for this selective and spot removal, but a lot of exotic shrubs, they're pretty dense. And it's critical that you just plan on at least 2 cycles of application before you get something from that, what is this phase, down to, okay, this I can manage. Herbicides do a lot of work for us, but they're not magic. So I'll say, unfortunately, there is still a lot of physical effort involved in any type of suppression regimen that you engage.
Okay, thank you, Art. Stephanie, anything else to add? Okay, yeah, I think you did good on that one, Art. Okay, so Steve was asking, where can I get a copy of the spreadsheet for the tool?
I can get it to him. So Steve, I can certainly give it to you. There is documentation that goes along with it. One of the things I didn't really stress is the tool worked for us, and particularly when Tom Forsmeyer was working with me, he was the whisperer. He could, like, let's just say it's not ready for prime time. It doesn't have that ease of use of you going up and pulling down some, well, like for instance, any of the IMAP invasive products, like those are ready for prime time. So I'd be happy to share it with you. And kind of, if if every once in a while you need to, sort of like the old TV, like, where do you hit it to get the signal to come in? Every once in a while it does do some funny things, but somehow through all of this, You send an email to me, I'll send it to you with the supporting information, and we can certainly have some back and forth as you work your way through it. But it's, like I say, it can be a little touchy, and it's macro driven. So your computer, for all of you, it's in Microsoft Excel. Your computer is going to say you don't want to open it. It's full of macros, which macros apparently in that Microsoft environment, do reduce the security of that particular file. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Someday we'll get this process ported into a GIS-based system, but some days not yet.
And I was going to say that can be something that we include in that follow-up email out to everybody. That way we can make sure we're sharing that out with everyone that tuned in today.
Actually, why don't sorry, Amy, why don't we just do it so I can just give you the link to it?
Yeah, that would be perfect.
I have directions for how to get around the macros. I wrote it down because we needed it so many times.
Perfect.
So
We'll make sure to include that. Okay, so Stephanie, this was a question about one of the slides in your presentation. The ecosystem slide with the map, what type of map is that? And I believe that was early on in your talk.
Sure. So those were the surrounding ecoregions, and I don't remember exactly what level they were at. So all of the U.S. Forest Service FIA data, forest inventory analysis data that were in the surrounding ecoregions for a park were compared to park data. So it was Forest Service FIA data compared with National Park Service data. And so those FIA data come from all forests in the ecoregion, right? That's lots of different ownerships and lots of different forest types.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, we had a question from Jim. He said, what can we learn from the VT success in managing invasives? I'm assuming that was the Vermont.
Yeah, I think that you can't be afraid to actually get in there and manage, right? Letting nature take its course frequently with invasives just doesn't work. We don't have the liberty or the luxury anymore to just say that's nature over there and we are just going to watch it. So that it is a working forest. It's been at that park. It has been a continually working forest for over 120 years. So they actually do silviculture. It's the only park in the National Park Service that does silviculture as part of their ecological and cultural management. But because of that, they're very aware of what's going on, and they've been actively removing invasive species. And so it works, right? That's why their line is going. That's why their line is going down.
Okay, great, thank you. We had a question come in asking what is the best way for private citizens to meaningfully contribute to this effort at their local parks?
I'm a big fan of iNaturalist. So if you contribute your observations of iNaturalist, they will automatically be sucked into our early detection program. So if you find new invasives, that will let us know. If you are finding old invasives, that just helps us understand better how they are in our parks. Also, there are so many volunteer work days. I know the Nature Conservancy has lots of volunteer work days on their properties and other protected areas, I would guess as well. There's a lot that citizens can do, even if you are not a certified herbicide applicator. You can help make a dent. On a local scale, enough people can actually make a real dent in invasive plants.
Yeah, I'll just echo that, Amy. So help with the surveys, find out where things are, and offer your hands, offer your service to a friends group. If it's if it doesn't exist, start one. Because let's put it this way, I'd be more than happy to help any park group here, particularly figure out how to best target their efforts to enhance maybe what the park is doing. Or maybe if you're at the municipal level, quite often they're not even really, quite often don't have the resources to engage in natural resource management. And there are well-established, if you will, weed warrior groups out there. The Maryland National Park, there's a lot of letters to it, but Northern Maryland and around Washington, D.C. has an extensive county level weed warrior program. So there's some tremendous templates. So we could definitely, personally, I'd be happy to help you sort of, okay, what do you got? And these are the species where you as a group can have the most impact, either yourself or in conjunction with the resources that that park might have.
And I'll also put a plug-in for IMAP invasives as well. There's multiple databases out there where this information is being tracked. Certainly iNaturalist is another one that's really great. And so IMAP is just another one too that's being used for, tracking where we're finding these species. So as long as you're putting the data somewhere, that's really the most important thing. Okay, let's see. Our next question is from Linda. She says, is mile-a-minute weevil available to private landowners?
That's a good question. The simplest thing to do is to contact the lab there in New Jersey, because otherwise I'll just fumble around. Now, once upon a time, you needed a state level permit from APHIS PTQ to get the license to have the weevils shipped to you. And I'm not clear. So that it's the Philip Alampi, ALAMPI, rearing laboratory in New Jersey. So I think if you Google that, that would get you to the contact, because like I said, I don't know what documentation you need, but they're basically selling them to anybody now who is willing to exchange. It might be like $2.50 per weevil, $2.50, but they're definitely available. But contact them and they can at least make sure that you have whatever documentation you need for your locality.
Okay, great, thank you. Our next question, what resource would you recommend listing with pictures of invasives in Pennsylvania? So we sort of answered that already with some of the resources we talked about with DCNR, Penn State Extension, the like. So I'll make sure that I send out those resources in the follow-up email. But was there anything that came to mind that we didn't mention before that you guys would want to talk about that would be like a good field guide or something like that?
Nothing comes to mind.
I feel, well, I think if you start with those two, particularly with the DCNR, since it is bordering on exhaustive as opposed to being highly selective. I mean, right there, you're going to be at 70 plus species. Mm-hmm. And I think, and they also distinguish them as, this is widespread and a problem everywhere, as opposed to, okay, this is kind of a rising threat and it's localized to this part of the state. I think that's a great place to start. Because one of those things, once you find one, you keep finding the citations and links to other things, and then you'll settle on what you like best.
Right.
But there's just a tremendous amount out there.
Yeah, the only things that came to mind for me, Pennsylvania Sea Grant in combination with Penn State University has created 2 field guides that are aquatic specific. So there is Pennsylvania's field guide to aquatic invasive species, and then there's also a Mid-Atlantic field guide to aquatic invasive species, both of which are available online. I can share those links out. There is also a Mid-Atlantic guide, I'm blanking on the full name, that is terrestrial based as well. And there is a new version of that guide that just came out this year. So I'll be happy to, I'm really going to get that comprehensive list going here. So we're thinking of everything today.
And I will say one of my favorite guides was put together by Matt Sarver and some others 15 years ago, but it's called Mistaken Identity. Really nice guide for just how to distinguish, because so many of our invasive species, even within the same genus, have native counterparts that are very difficult to distinguish. So I really like that resource just because it really does help you pull, good, target versus non-target. So I really like that one.
Yeah, I agree. That is also a really good one. So I just want to mention, we are definitely over time. So if folks want to continue to stay on as we answer questions, please hang in there. But if you have to leave, this is all being recorded, so folks can check this out at another time. But again, thanks for everyone who has stuck with us here at 11:15. So appreciate it. All right, so we have another question. Where to find the article? I'm assuming that is referring to the tool, and we will be sending out a link to that tool afterwards, unless there's another article that you guys Noah, that
I'm
you
sure
mentioned
it's your,
facts that I'm not
I
thinking.
suspect it's your newsletter article, or,
That could be, yes. Yes,
the
and I will be
IMAP
sending
invasive.
that out as well. People are going to get all sorts of good stuff from us afterwards. So yeah, I'll be sending out a link to that newsletter article too. Okay, we have a question from Emily. She said, in Pennsylvania, do all agencies and organizations like DCNR, National Park Service, etc., use IMAP invasives observations for invasive plant planning? Should we use that to log observations instead of EDMAPs or iNaturalist? So, fantastic question. I would say that, yes, these agencies certainly do use the platform. It is not something that, has been, I guess I would say, adopted by the entire agency, but it is something that is being used by individuals in many different groups and different people that are outside of agencies, but maybe work for like a nonprofit or a consulting firm that does something, environmentally related. I mean, at this point, we do have over 2,000 registered users of Pennsylvania IMAP invasives, and that really spans the gamut of people. So I would say, again, of course, I'm going to, be biased and say, yes, please use IMAP invasives to record your findings. But really, I think the best thing to say is as long as you're recording your data somewhere, that's the most important thing. Don't leave it in your notebook in your desk. That's not going to help a lot of people. We want to make sure that we're putting that in a centralized location somewhere, like IMAP invasives, but iNaturalist and EDMAPs are two other locations as well that data can go. And so in IMAP invasives, I will mention quickly, we recently included a mapping data layer that you can turn on iNaturalist data directly in IMAP invasives. That is the most recent 5 years worth of data. So you can actually look at both of those data sets, IMAP and iNaturalist, simultaneously at the same time, at least the most recent data that is coming from iNaturalist. So kind of a cool feature that we now do offer in the platform. Okay, let's see here. We just had a comment from Raja Deep saying it was the one in the river with the boats and the 3 volunteer women, I think was the photo that was being referred to earlier, if you'll recall that, Art. We were asking about a particular photo.
Oh, so that was also Ohio Pile. So still in the middle. So those are 3 of my colleagues. That was Emily Rojic. I know her name. Ali Kazi, Miranda Fuchs. I just, those are like 3 of my colleagues in sort of our, our peak work period, like between 15 and 19, they were critical elements to that. But that was the key thing, is they were smiling, and that was the end of the day, at Ohio Pile. So
nice. It must have been a good day then.
isn't every day.
Very good. Okay, we had a question from Tim. He said, I have not used the IMAP app often. Are you aware of people misidentifying non-invasive plants as invasive and recording them? And the answer to that is yes, it does happen. Not frequently, but it does happen. But the nice part about IMAP invasives is because we are participating jurisdiction, participating state in the IMAP invasives network, myself and several other people with the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy and the Pennsylvania Natural Heritage Program serve as the staff that kind of, administer all parts of that program. And that includes QCing or quality checking every single record that comes in from the online platform where people can record data, whether that's, the computer version or the mobile apps. And so, yeah, we do have data that comes in. For example, I think we had some information come in that was recorded as giant hogweed, and our experts took a look at it, and it was actually, I believe it was cow parsnip. So one of the lookalikes that can easily be confused. So we catch that and we change the data, or we remove it as necessary to make sure that any data that's being labeled as confirmed is indeed the species that that we know to be. So that is part of our process. We're making sure that everything is quality checked. Okay, let's see. We have a question from Jared. He said, homeowner here. Any advice on controlling privet? We're back to privet again. It's just me using mechanical controls mainly. Oriental bittersweet, stiltgrass, and knotweed are also present. So what are some suggestions for managing some of those species?
I'd say dogged persistence. You know, with the privet, picture this as a multi-year process. If you know, if you just want to do it mechanically, you can cut it to the ground, and really, you know, it's just going to keep firing up shoots. And after a while, you sort of get this sense of letting it grow enough that you know it has expended energy to create that biomass, but before that biomass has had a chance to, if you will, create a lot of foliage, and then start sending energy back down. So, and then you can get to the point where, you know, you start to see, boy, this thing is really weak. And as the top is showing that weakness, well, you've got a lot less root mass there. You know, you could probably get to the point where, okay, now I can dig these things out much more easily. You know, whereas a full-blown privet infestation, you know, you're going to need an excavator to dig it out. Several cycles over a couple years of, you know, defoliating it, you might get to the point where you can dig it out. Now, the other species, and you're all over the map in terms of life cycles or growth forms, because, you know, stiltgrass, it's creating a seed bank. You know, basically you have this perpetual source, and it's going to come up every year. And it's just a species that once it's kind of there, like for instance, when we manage it, we don't suggest that we're going to get a site so it doesn't have stiltgrass. You know, our best objective is, I just want to restore the native community that you want there. Quite often it's in a forest. So, okay, we have established the regeneration we need for that next generation of mature canopy decades down the line. And there's going to be stiltgrass there. Or if you're maintaining a meadow, an herbaceous opening, a pollinator planting, well, you know, maybe when you first establish it, there's a couple of years of concurrent suppression of stiltgrass until your desired species established. And it's like, okay, I have this great pollinator meadow with some stiltgrass in it. So, you know, that's sort of like, if you really don't want it somewhere, you pull it out because it's just going to keep coming up. You can cut that. If you wait till about, let's just say July, and you cut it to the ground with a weed whacker, it shouldn't come back. If it's in a lawn, you can mow it forever and it'll survive fine. So you're looking at mechanical there. Things like vines, bittersweet, first step, even if we were approaching it with a chemical method, is still cut it first at ground level and force it to regrow, because you can't do anything with the vines that are up in the canopy, because well, you just can't selectively treat them. And, you know, so if you cut it and force it to regrow, and in your case, like bittersweet, you know, actually, if you're not dealing with these monstrous 2-3 inch, 6 inch thick vines, as you cut it and force it to regrow, that pulls fairly readily. It seems to have that tensile strength that, you know, it doesn't just snap off. So if you kind of beat it down to the point where you're now talking like pinky sized vines, those will pull. I forget some of the others. Particularly if you're not going to use chemicals, it's just like you're going to pull it, you're going to cut it. Perennials you need to cut repeatedly. Like knotweed is one. I have yet to see any documentation of somebody getting rid of knotweed in a non-chemical method. What I've seen people do though is cut it repeatedly and then, for instance, seed that site into like a turf-like situation that they mow. So that at least, okay, you know it's still there. If you turn your back and walk away, it'll come back, but at least you've got it now to this maintained setting as opposed to, you know, this jungle of knotweed. Sorry, that was all over, but in the end, it's persistence.
Yeah, very good. And Stephanie, anything to add to that? Okay. All right, so we had a question from Nancy. She said, sorry, I joined late. I am dealing with what to do to get rid of poison hemlock.
and there you're dealing with a seed bank again. My experience is that if you're, well, so in the settings where we have engaged it on a prolonged basis, the seed bank does seem to be finite. And after 3 or 4 seasons of suppression, we find that, okay, it really is becoming a here and there sort of incident. And being a biennial, what I would stress is that you have this window of operations from about, May of the year that it germinated, when, now you can at least detect that little rosette, all the way through that season into the winter, into early the next spring. I mean, it's going to start to bolt in May. Like, you don't want to deal with it when you're looking at it at eye level. You want to work on it at that rosette phase. And being a biennial and not being dormant in the winter, you definitely have these opportunities when non-targets are dormant. So that'd be something to think about. But persistence, again, and we, using that chemical or herbicide-based approach, we have found after 3 or 4 seasons, it largely is gone from a site.
Okay, very good. And then we just had some follow-up comments from Dawn about the mile-a-minute weevil. She said, I have purchased the weevil from New Jersey for my private lot. About $1 per weevil was the price that she paid. Okay, we had a question from Anne. She says, is there any thought to changing the warrior language to something like habitat stewards versus weed warriors?
That's a great point, because it's, kind of a conversation I have a lot, because I am just accustomed, I've been dealing with, I'll say, vegetation management or weed management since the mid 80s, and it is very much a combative frame of mind. There are definitely groups. There's a group in Pittsburgh, and Amy, I can't think of the name, but I think it's the Pittsburgh Parks Conservancy. I think they have a group that is very much, their naming is got some steward concept as opposed to warrior concept.
I know the group you're talking about. I'm blanking on the name myself right now too. I'll have to look it up. Yeah.
But I think it's a great point. And I from what you were saying early, Amy, I think it definitely helps us mentally realize this really is, well, what I find is when I'm talking to groups that, kind of get these Dr. Death monikers, like, no, I'm a nurturer. I'm releasing native plants. I mean, we're having all this discussion about what this herbicide does to this plant and sort of marveling in, that's dead and that's awesome. But, really it is a nurturing and stewardship endeavor. So I think the question is great, and we really should start integrating that paradigm into the naming in our lexicon.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think that definitely shapes how we think about the whole process, is some of the names of these groups. So yeah, it's a great question from Anne. Stephanie, did you have anything you wanted to add to that? I want to make sure we're getting both sides from everything from both of you for these questions. Okay, so we have a few more questions. Oh, thank you, Gavin. I'm just going to jump down really quick. Eco Stewards in Pittsburgh was the name of that group. So thanks for reminding us on that one, Gavin. So we had a question from Shauna. She says, as a homeowner, I have Bermuda grass spreading rapidly and I can't control it manually. This has been going on for 3 years. It's breaking up our driveway. Should I move to an herbicide method? I have native plantings nearby and don't want them to be affected.
Yeah, I'll just say operationally, well, yes, with the understanding that herbicides replace, to a large extent, think of herbicides replace labor, and you sort of emphasize how ridiculously challenging it is would be to mechanically or non-chemically deal with Bermuda grass. If you're trying to pull out those stolons and rhizomes. So there's definitely tools if you want to do that. I guess, certainly, and if it's mixed in with things, selectively removing Bermuda grass from other grasses or ground covers, we'll have chemical options for that. So, once again, I guess if you go that route, you're definitely going, I would say, have more tools at your disposal.
Okay, and anything to add, Stephanie?
No, Art is the expert in all of these things.
Okay, very good. And it looks like we just have 2 other comments. So Joanna says, thank you for the wonderful session. Looking forward to rewatching the webinar and seeing the resource list. And we had another comment from Stephanie. She said, at Glen Providence Park in Media, we have a weekly conservation crew. That's the name of their group, conservation crew. And we've made progress against Japanese knotweed by digging it out repeatedly. So it sounds like they're having some good success there. So that is it. Again, thank you everyone for sticking it out, for those that are still on the webinar and staying on a little bit longer to be part of our Q&A. And thank you again, Art, Stephanie, this has been great. I'm really looking forward to watching the presentation again, because I definitely need to refresh on some of the things we talked about. Looking forward to sharing this out with everyone as well, and as well as the resources that we talked about here today. Art and Stephanie, if you're okay, I will plan to share your contact information in case folks have any follow-up questions. And with that, we'll wrap things up, and I'll be sure to share out the recording and other resources here as soon as I can. So thank you all very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.